So now it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker. François Louis is Associate Professor at Bard Graduate Center, studies in the decorative arts, design, and culture. His research focuses on the art and material culture of the Khitan Liao dynasty in northern China, but also ranges more broadly across the history of Chinese artifacts, including topics from early antiquity to the 18th century. His publications on China's antiquarian culture, the history of ornament, and on gold and silver include the book Goldsmithing of the Tang and Song Dynasties, which I'm not going to pronounce in my terrible German pronunciation. Which examines the formation of the goldsmithing profession in China. Professor Louis served as editor of the scholarly journal Artibus Asiae from 2002 to 2008. His most recent book and exhibition is Design by the Book, Chinese Ritual Objects, and the Sanli Tu. This was is now on exhibition at the Bard Graduate Center, and the book was published in 2017, just published. Professor Louis also contributed an essay to the Freer and Sackler's Shipwreck, Tang Treasures, and Monsoon Winds, and this afternoon he is going to speak to us about gold and silver. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much, Adriana. And thank you, Agnes, and the Tang Center, as well as the Asia Society, for the invitation. So as you know by now, a substantial amount of Tang gold and silver was reported from the Belitung wreck. Is this how it works? This includes 7 gold vessels. So these are all the gold objects that were found on this shipwreck. 7 vessels. There are 2 of these dishes, one of which you see at the exhibition, a round dish, 3 oblong bowls, 2 of which are the same, decorated, and one that's undecorated. This one is also in view. The much talked about hexagonal cup, a bracelet that's intact, and 2 fragments of 2 different bracelets. There was about 2 kilograms of gold foil, and this tiny thing that's Javanese gold currency that's known as a piloncito. That's about 2.5 grams of gold. It's currency. It's like a coin, except it's not flat. It's round. The find also included about 24 silver vessels and 18 silver ingots. I show you 2 ingots and a selection of these silver vessels. I'll talk a few in a second. The silver ingots, as far as I know, all looked the same and were all about 2 kilograms in weight. That accounts to 50 liang, 50 ounces, which was a standard weight in the Tang period at the time. So the silver was quite corroded in many instances and does not look as splendid as the gold. But we can still get a good sense of the style and the high quality of craftsmanship. And we can see that the vessels form a homogeneous group that was made around the same time and place, certainly in southern China in the Jiangnan region, and presumably in the 820s, 830s, or thereabouts. Let me show you some details of the better preserved pieces. A number of the small boxes survived in good condition because they were in these larger silver boxes, which are very corroded. There's I don't know the exact number of these small cosmetics or medicine boxes that were found, something like a dozen. They're all decorated with relief decoration on the lid and then a flat chase decoration on the bottom. There were also large platters that were found. I've never seen the actual platters. When I was working on this 10 years ago, I got an X-ray. So from that, you get a bit of a sense of what these platters look like. This one also has macara decoration, just like Liu Yang showed us in a large silver platter a few minutes ago. So I don't know the status of the conservation of this. Presumably, they've been conserved now and maybe look more splendid than this X-ray. And here is the large bottle that was also in bad condition. The lid was, the neck was broken, and the back side of it is covered still in corrosion. So there's, this is like the only good angle of the object, of which I have a picture where you see something of the decoration. So this find is significant, not only because it is the earliest shipwreck with Chinese precious metals in Southeast Asia. It's also one of the largest Tang gold and silver finds ever. It's the fourth largest gold find, in fact, and the third largest silver find if you measure this based on weight. I want to briefly introduce the other large finds to give you a context to gauge the economic and social significance of these Belito finds, which is basically my main objective in this talk. And then we can, we'll add in a way to Derek Heng's talk that we've heard this morning. We can continue spinning his narrative about how the shipwreck might have traveled and what kind of people might have been involved in the transactions in China. Discoveries of Tang gold objects are indeed exceedingly rare. This isn't surprising because gold was extremely expensive, on average 10 times the value of silver, sometimes, and in some places, even up to 20 times. The greatest amount of Tang gold and silver ever found comes from a treasure hoard in Pinglu in Shanxi province, was found in 1971 and is quite unknown. This find consisted of 82 ingots of various shapes, 82 belt ornaments, and over a dozen bracelets, altogether weighing some 33 kilograms. There was no silver in this hoard. So this is more than 7 times the amount of gold on the shipwreck, and like 4 times the amount of the second largest gold find that we have. Who could have owned this kind of truly extraordinary gold and silver treasure? Fortunately, there are inscriptions on some of these objects. One identifies an ingot as belonging to a Duke, Zhang Tongru, and another mentions the date 758. We know this Mr. Zhang from the historical record. He was one of An Lushan's chief strategists who was active throughout An's famous rebellion. And it thus seems likely that this gold was loot from the Tang capitals, which were plundered in 756 and 757. I presume part of that loot was gold jewelry and other objects. These were melted down and made into these ingots. and then probably hidden as the rebellion started to falter in the 760s. So we have a large find, and we got some sense of who might have been involved in this type of wealth. The fact that this Pinglu treasure included bracelets is interesting, and it points to the widespread use of gold jewelry at the time as a store of wealth. It can also be related to the bracelet and bracelet fragments from the Belitung wreck. I think this suggests that those two fragments here, they may not be accidental. Since gold doesn't decay, even underwater in salt water, it's probably more likely that these are remnants of bracelets that were cut on purpose and used as a form of payment, like some of the gold ingots in this Pinglu hoard. The next largest find may also have been buried as a result of the Anlushan rebellion, but in this case, it was presumably to safeguard it from the rebels. It contained twice as much gold and 3 times as much silver as the Belitung find. And while we do not know the owner of this Hojiatsan treasure, we can tell that it was a high-ranking courtier, possibly a nobleman, given the exclusive Chang'an neighborhood it had been buried in. There were 30 gold and 421 silver coins. Here's one example of it. These were gifts that the emperor was giving out personally to favored courtiers. And their presence, to me, confirms the high status of the owner of this treasure. But we don't know who it might have been. It might have been a wealthy foreign merchant. It might have been a courtier. It had also interesting, a very similar, about 2 kilograms of gold foil as we found on the shipwreck. 11 gold vessels, the shipwreck had 7. So even though it weighed a little more, it's not that different. Had a lot of silver, on the other hand. Silver had a lot of silver ingots of various strange shapes, at a time when silver ingots were not quite standardized in the way they should be shaped. Undecorated vessels, very sophisticated vessels, cups of various shapes and designs. Some look Central Asian, some look very Chinese. This hoard is very famous and is known to exemplify the early Tang silversmithing tradition. The objects date from the late 7th and the first half of the 8th centuries. And as the large amount of silver bullion shows, silver by that time was recognized as a store of value, even if the ingots do not show standardized designs yet. This is something new when we're talking about silver. Gold has long been recognized as a standard of wealth in China, but silver really only started to take on this type of function in the 7th century. And this kind of embrace, this Tang embrace of silver, was largely a response to Central Asian and Inner Asian custom, where this material was widely used and circulated, both for vessels as well as currency. Was largely mediated into China through Sogdian traders in the 7th century. Silver became even more widespread as a means of payment for large sums after the Anlushan rebellion in early 760s. At the time, fine silks became scarce. Fine silks were the usual way of paying high amount sums. But as I said, silver is starting to take over that role. That doesn't mean silks went out of use, but there's sort of a new high value material being introduced. Silver is quite different from silk as a high value payment. Because silver was mined privately and it circulated both as vessels and ingots, it necessitated continual weighing and assaying. This kind of task was performed not by the government, but by professional silversmiths. It was these specialist assayers and craftsmen who, over the course of the late 8th and 9th centuries, formed the first private banking system and private banking institutions in China. The Tang silver shops were simple banks that would change silver into cash. They would broker the sale of gold and silver, and they would act as safe deposit firms. They did not yet give credit or invest as they would in the Song dynasty about 200 years later, though. Still, silver by the late 8th century had become widely accepted as a high-end commodity and had spread well beyond the foreign diaspora into use in wide upper class segments of society. The third massive gold and silver find is the pagoda deposit of Faman Temple. We've seen a little bit of that, also mentioned earlier this day. It gives us examples of silver used by the imperial family. Notably, Emperors Yizong and Xizong between the 850s and 874 when this pagoda deposit was closed. It also includes ritual objects that were commissioned by the most highly positioned eunuchs and the Buddhist clergy in the early 870s. Here are several of the gold objects. Some are reliquary caskets, alms bowls that were used in the worship of the Buddha's finger bone relics that were stored at this temple. The temple itself was sponsored and supported by the court. So we know quite a lot about this find because it was accompanied by an inventory and a history as well, written in stone in the crypt. So altogether, I counted 8 objects out of gold, ritual objects, weighing about 5.2 kilograms, and there were 113 silver objects weighing 60 kilograms or thereabouts, mostly manufactured objects rather than ingots or gold foil. There was none of that. Some of the 121 gold and silver objects were manufactured in the imperial workshops in Chang'an, but the majority was commissioned from private silversmiths in various parts of the country, including the Jiangnan region, which had become the main Chinese silverworking center in the 9th century. Actually, there were, by the way, talking about cloves, there was also a large amount of cloves that was donated to this treasure. I want to show you one example of these Jiangnan manufactured silver boxes or silver objects, which is a silver box used by Emperor Yizong himself when worshipping the famous Buddha finger relic. We know that this box had earlier been a gift to the emperor from a top official whose name is Li Fu, who died in 877. It was one of thousands of silver objects of this type that late Tang emperors expected to receive as gifts, mostly from their high officials in southern China. Such respectfully presented gifts, they are called respectfully presented because that was one of the standard inscriptions that they had. So such gifts were part of an imperial revenue system that was entirely separate from official tribute and official taxation. These were gifts that were given for birthdays, for various holidays during the year, and they ended up in the emperor's private storeroom, which is sometimes called Neiku or the Dainku. And this box has the Neiku inscribed on the bottom as well. So we know quite a lot about the history of this box. We know about its provenance, and we know how it got to come into the emperor's possession. We don't know when exactly it was made or when this took place, but comparing it stylistically, this might have been as early as the 850s, when Li Fu was at the height of his power already. What's interesting to me is that the box's design and craftsmanship is comparable to the Belitung gold. Although the imperial box was made a few years later, it shows similar motifs as the gold dishes, the one that we've seen so many times in particular. It shows the knots, and it also has similar floral designs. If I go back. Well, this is probably too small to see, but there are flowers on the side here that are really very similar to these flowers. And you might be able to make out this identical motif as this knot here. There's also an imperial collection of these two dishes. If you look more carefully at the design itself, there is the swastika motif in the center, and then there are the four knots on the outside. You can read those. The swastika is read as one. The knots are shou. So if you read it as a rebus, you can read this as the imperial birthday wish, or the type of wish that a member of the imperial family would get for their birthdays. So there is an implied imperial use in the design itself of this vessel that links this up, perhaps, with this respectful gifting requirement of the 9th century officials to the court. So it means one shou, 10,000 years. The vessel itself doesn't bear any inscriptions like this box, for instance. So we don't have like final proof that it was in the possession of the court. But it seems to me that this kind of object was really designed as a gift for imperial birthdays. Whether it ended up being used as that is up to speculation. Regina Kral was mentioning these wares yesterday as well. We see the same kind of inscriptions on some ceramics. The green glazed ceramics from the Shipwreck have, there's one that has the inscription of Ying, as if it was made to be shipped to the court. And there's one that has an inscription, Jinfeng, presented respectfully. Again, that's code for being requisitioned as an imperial gift. So were they or were they not at the court? I think they were probably intended to be in any case. Perhaps like the gold pieces that ended up on the ship, these things never made it to the court. And they somehow were siphoned out of the cycle. We don't know. But perhaps they were for the court, and the emperor regifted them or some of his all-powerful eunuchs did that without the emperor's knowing. We know from the historical records for sure that imperial regifting and court corruption had reached extraordinary levels at the 820s. The largest such distribution of imperial wealth is recorded for 826, not too long before the Belitung shipwreck set sail. Emperor Jingzong at the time presented deserving subjects with some 4 metric tons of silver and nearly 300 kilograms of gold. This kind of generosity required massive gifts for the emperor beforehand, some of which were also recorded. Between 824 and 827, Governor Wang Bo of Yangzhou, for instance, sent over 5,900 silver vessels to the profligate teenage Emperor Jingzong. Similarly, the governor of nearby Runzhou, that was Li Deyu at the time, was ordered to send silver boxes weighing nearly 1 metric ton in 824. Li left a memorial where he complains that this order went far beyond the resources of his prefecture and that he had to actually go buy silver elsewhere, and he went to the marketplace in Yangzhou where he obtained that silver. Li Deyu, by the way, also commissioned a Buddhist reliquary that very same year, and this reliquary survives and was discovered in 1960s. You see here the outer box of it. It compares very closely to the Belitung silver vessel is in style, and I think it is one of the ways you can identify this Belitung silver as coming from the Jiangnan region and falling into this style of the 820s. Certainly your Lower Yangtze style. Here's another comparison to a Belitung object. If you, I'm sorry, I didn't anticipate this screen to be so small, but you can see the same kind of plant and flower motifs as you see on this side of the silver casket. So looking at these comparable larger finds, we see that gold and silver in the 9th century was at the core of a network of wealth. It linked private mining, gold and silversmithing, and a fledgling banking system to the imperial court and the various elites close to the emperor, high government officers, high clergy, and the top eunuchs. What the Belitung find really confirms is that grand merchants, too, were part of this world in some way. Indeed, historical records mention figures like the Persian merchant Li Sucha as having contact with the court. They don't speak about merchants owning silver or paying in silver. So that's why this shipwreck is really quite an important additional piece of evidence in something that I guess seems kind of obvious, but still the traditional Chinese textual sources don't speak of it. They speak of Li Susha mostly because they want to make clear that the court was very corrupt at the time. Li, as we heard also this morning, in 824, presented Emperor Jingzong with enough fragrant agar wood to build an entire pleasure pavilion. This expensive imported wood was otherwise used only in small quantities, usually for incense or medicine. Li must have been in control of a large trading operation to be able to make such a valuable gift. He also must have been connected with influential eunuchs who arranged for what the stalwart Confucians at the time considered a very decadent gift. So a grand merchant could easily have bought gold and silver on the Yangzhou market, or he could have obtained it from the court in recognition of services provided to the emperor. We know that the young emperors in the 820s and 830s neglected government and that the court was largely controlled by powerful eunuchs at the time. But this does not necessarily mean that the precious metals on the Belitung wreck could not also have been provided by a high official who chose to invest his fortune in international commerce. That did also exist. Despite laws forbidding government officials to compete for profit, or even though overt trade remained disreputable for educated Confucian elites, it was nonetheless common for late Tang officials to invest heavily in business. Yangzhou, in particular, to use an assessment by Dennis Twitchett, had been packed with such official-owned enterprises since the 780s. And in the trading port of Guangzhou, as far away from the central government, it wasn't uncommon to have governors who openly enriched themselves on the maritime trade. Again, we've already heard the references to this type of corruption. Wang He, for instance, who held the position of governor from 795 to 801, is said to have sent 10 fully laden ships to the south each day. I guess that's in the 3 months when the winds blew south. And then when the winds blew north, he was recorded as having monopolized the purchase of all rare goods in the incoming ships. Others, such as Hu Zhang, 25 years later, was similarly engaged in private trading. He apparently accumulated enough wealth in just 3 years to buy and furnish several blocks of prime real estate in the capital. He didn't make it back to enjoy it, though. So one more point. While it's possible, even likely, that influential members of the Chinese elite owned and shared in the Belitung cargo, the shipping and trading operation itself was probably overseen by a non-Chinese merchant, perhaps somebody like this Li Susha. The gold objects in particular hint at that. They suggest that they were not just made for gifting and feasting, but also served as merchandise at some level. If you look at their backside, they show weight inscriptions in Chinese, carefully chased by a silversmith. It's here, and here's an enlargement. But they're also engraved ciphers, possibly in a foreign script, and there are numerous scratch marks left by people who tested the gold for its purity. So there are all these scratches. 3 different ones. I think when these were restored, they made very certain that it's clear these are original scratches. These were not done after the objects were found. These were already there early on, and they left some sections, not on this vessel, but on another, untreated to show that these scratches were original. And here's one of these strange ciphers. It's engraved. It's not done by goldsmiths because you remove some of the gold when you engrave it. I don't know whether I'm holding this upside down, whether this is even a form of writing. It's definitely not Chinese. I'll show you another instance where you see this writing. I don't know, John, is this Malay? I don't know. Perhaps somebody in this audience has a good idea whether this is writing or whether these are just markings. They're certainly not coincidental signs. And again, they're scrape marks to check for gold purity. So we cannot say for certain when these marks were made, given that some of the vessels clearly were not brand new by the time they came on the Belitung ship. Like the undecorated vessel in the exhibition has a lot of scrapes and signs of use. So these were not brand new, at least that one wasn't. But the markings nonetheless identify the gold vessels as commodities, ultimately, and as stores of value. And as such, they were treated like other precious things on the wreck, the gold foil, the bracelets, and the silver ingots. They were high-value trade goods, both in China and in the international trade. Thank you.